Hey everyone, I am doing this video today because I want to talk about meningeal worm, which is also called deer worm or brain worm, and sometimes just M worm for short for meningeal worm. It is completely unlike any other worm that goats get. It is not an intestinal worm, and it's actually not even a worm that goats normally get. You've heard me say before lots of times that worms are species specific. So goats can't get worms from cows and pigs and horses and vice versa. Goats and sheep and camelids, your camelids are alpacas and llamas. They do share some worms. So if they're together in the same pasture, they might pass worms around. But for the most part, most worms are unique to each species. Meningeal worm is a worm that is normally in white-tailed deer and only white-tailed deer. So if you live in the Western US and do not have white-tailed deer, then you don't have to listen anymore unless you're listening for a friend who is in the part of the United States that has white-tailed deer, because only white-tailed deer carry this worm. And when white-tailed deer go through your pasture, they're going to poop, leave behind some presents there. And in that poop is larvae from the meningeal worms. And if the goats ate it right there, it wouldn't be a problem. What happens is there is an intermediate host. The snails or slugs crawl over the poop and get the larvae. They pick up the larvae in their slime. And so if a goat accidentally eats the snail or the slug, then they will get infected. Or it can also be left behind in their slime trail. So if they're leaving slime on leaves or grass in the pasture, then they, if the goats eat that, then they can be infected. Now, the crazy thing about meningeal worm is that it just takes one worm to kill a goat. That's it. And it's because of where it goes. So it is not normally in goats. And so it gets a little confused when it gets eaten. And it takes 2 or 3 months to get to the spinal column of a goat. And that's where it actually does its damage. Now, it can take any route, and it can wander around inside a goat's body for months. So if it gets close to the skin, the goat might get itchy and start rubbing itself and can wind up with sores on the outside of its body. But this doesn't always happen. In fact, we lost all of our llamas to meningeal worm. We've had 3 goats with meningeal worm, and we've never seen any external lesions or sores. But at Cornell, they say that they've seen that quite a bit. So it's unique. That's the thing about meningeal worm that is just, it's very confusing. The other thing is that the symptoms can mimic a lot of other things. So when a goat has meningeal worm, it can wind up paralyzing. Like if it gets into the spine towards the back end of the body, you can have back end paralysis where the 2 legs don't work. That was the first case we ever had. That was the situation. It was in a llama, and she could not stand up and walk on her own. If we lifted her up to her feet and she tried to walk, she was crossing her hind legs like this. And then, of course, she was tripping herself and she'd fall down. So, and that's because she couldn't really feel her hind legs because the worm had damaged her spinal column. And in other llamas we had, they didn't always get the back end paralysis. Some of them just started having trouble walking at all. They might have full body paralysis or just seem weak or stumbly and stuff like that. For the goats that got it, the first goat of ours that got it, I actually thought she had wound up with a spinal cord injury because we found her laying in the snow. And so I assumed somebody had like hit her, like T-boned her and broken her spine. We brought her inside. She couldn't stand, but she was just the happiest goat in the world. Once we brought her into a nice warm barn, we put food in front of her. She ate like a maniac. She drank water. She was just ready to party, except that she could not stand up at all. Her legs were completely paralyzed. Her sister wound up with symptoms about 3 weeks later. And with her sister, it was even more different. In fact, I detail all of this in an article that I wrote about meningeal worm, which I will share with you in the description here. But her sister's symptoms were more neurologic. She could not stand unless if she was leaning against something, she could stand. If she tried to walk, she would walk in a circle, which sounds like listeriosis, which is nicknamed circling disease. And we thought she was blind at first, but when we flicked our fingers at her, she would blink. So because she was just like, she was staring into space. So when we first took her into the vet, they also thought listeriosis, but then changed the diagnosis to meningeal worm and wound up treating her for that. And she's the only goat that we've ever had that actually recovered from it. And it was probably because she got sick about 3 weeks after her sister. And then it totally made sense because we had this llama at the University Vet Hospital, and we had this paralyzed goat at home, which we thought was due to a spinal cord injury. But then when her sister wound up with symptoms that could also be meningeal worm, it all looked like these 3 things were connected. And indeed they were. So basically we had a llama and 2 goats with meningeal worm. And the one that started treatment the day we saw symptoms was able to recover almost fully. She was left with like a tilt to her head, but if you didn't know why, you would have just thought that was her own little weird thing, that she just walked around with her head tilted. With her sister, unfortunately, treatment did not work at all. And so we had her put down, and they did a necropsy and found the worm in her brainstem. So putting her down was the right decision because she never would have been able to recover from that. And unfortunately, what happened with llama was that she was treated. And so when it comes to meningeal worm, recovery does not mean a complete reversal of symptoms. Normally with worms, you treat a goat and they recover and then they're fine. Because the meningeal worm is in the spinal column, not fine. So the goat wound up, the llama wound up never recovering. We brought her home after she was at the vet hospital for over a week, and we had to lift her to her feet multiple times a day. Initially, she couldn't stand for more than about 15 minutes before she'd collapse. She got all the way up to about 2 or 3 hours standing before she'd collapse, and then we'd have to lift her up again. And then she started going backwards. And so after 6 months of trying to work with her, we finally realized that we needed to put her down, that she was never actually going to regain use of her legs and be able to stand on her own. It was really sad because we put her out in the pasture, and she would fall down. And then one day it started raining, we had to run out there and lift her up and get her to the shelter so that she wasn't just laying there in the rain the whole time. And obviously she would have been a complete sitting duck for a coyote or any, predator that came up on her. There's no way she would have been able to get away from them. So it was a very hard decision to make, but, after trying for 6 months to help her, it was very hard to finally admit defeat and to let her go. But it was the right thing to do because she did not have a good quality of life. The third goat that we had that got meningeal worm presented completely differently. And that was initially he started limping on his front leg. And meningeal worm never crossed my mind. You always think of things, like, what have I seen before? And many years ago, we had a goat that was limping on her front leg, and it turned out to be a soft tissue injury, and it just needed, she just needed some rest, and it healed up on its own. There was nothing, to do to heal a soft tissue injury. And so that's what I assumed it was with him. And then after 2 weeks of limping on his front leg, he could not walk at all. And at that point, my husband said, this kind of reminds me of meningeal worm. And so I contacted one of the vet professors who I know, and she said, yeah, that definitely sounds like meningeal worm. Another thing to think about, though, would possibly be rabies. So there's a number of different things, it could be the symptoms for meningeal worm are very similar to listeriosis, which I mentioned already. Especially if you have a goat that's doing something weird with their eyes, walking in circles, because that's nicknamed circling disease. Goat polio and thiamine deficiency can have similar symptoms to meningeal worm, and rabies can have similar symptoms. So it can be challenging trying to figure out what to do. And the treatment for all of these things is completely different. So the treatment for meningeal worm is 5 days of Safeguard at 5 times the dosage on the label. And Safeguard is the treatment of choice because it can cross the blood-brain barrier, which it has to do to reach a worm in the spinal column. They had used ivermectin with the Safeguard for a lot of years, but Cornell did a study that didn't really look like the ivermectin was adding anything to the treatment, because one thing is ivermectin does not cross the blood-brain barrier. So it's not clear how it could have helped if it had helped. So the most important part is Safeguard, 5 times the label dosage for 5 days to treat meningeal worm. And the treatment for all these other things is completely different because they're not worms. They're like infections that require antibiotics, or a thiamine deficiency requires injectable prescription thiamine. Rabies has no treatment whatsoever. So, that's a really scary one if you have an animal that, if you ever have a goat that gets rabies. Probably the most rare of all of them, but you shouldn't rule anything out. So in terms of meningeal worm, so the reason I'm talking about it now is because it's January, and this is when you typically would see an animal come down with it. Our first animal came down with it in November, like over 10 years ago. And that's about the earliest you usually see it. I mean, they have seen it all 12 months a year at Cornell. They have a lot of experience with this in New York State because white-tailed deer are quite abundant there. And so you can see it at any time of year. However, fall and winter are the times that you see it the most, because it takes months for the larva to reach the infective stage. And then once it gets into the goat, it can wander around for months before it reaches the spinal column and starts to do any damage. And the reason that it's so hard for an animal to recover from meningeal worm is because once you've got nerve damage, nerve damage is just very hard to overcome. So it is definitely my least favorite worm of all. And the other thing too is that you cannot count on cold weather killing meningeal worm. They did a study where they put the larva in a freezer below 0 for a whole week, and it was still alive. So I don't think any of us, probably hardly anyone listening to this, lives in a place where they would have temperatures below 0 for more than a week. And I always wish, like, why didn't they keep going? Like, it's in a freezer. But anyway, they didn't. But seriously, probably they didn't keep going because they're like, well, yeah, there's nobody that lives in a place where it's going to be below 0 for more than a week. So there's really no point. So unlike a lot of worms that, can die on pasture in the winter, the meningeal worm does not. So that is another frustration of that worm. So if spring comes and it can still be alive on the pasture when the snails and slugs start crawling around again. So I hope that this has been helpful for you. If you have any questions, please feel free to post in the comment section below and we'll get back to you.